Hi everyone, this is Mike. I'm a game designer currently living in Shanghai. Sorry I couldn't join you guys in person for a video call. Thanks again, Chris, for inviting me to give a little lecture to your class about my game. I have a quick little presentation I'll show you guys about sort of the game and sort of how I came about making it. So, Novel Containment was a pretty interesting project for myself. Basically, we were traveling for Chinese New Year and we are staying in a town nearby Shanghai. When we had got word that Wuhan was going into lockdown, at that time it was pretty crazy because no one really knew what was sort of going on. So some of the representative town officials came by and they told everyone in the hotel that it was probably a good time to go home because they were getting word that other cities were kind of in the process of getting locked down in a way of trying to contain this new sort of thing that was happening. Now, I think the big thing was at the time we thought it was closer to say like the swine flu or the bird flu, where we thought it was just something that China was going to have to deal with. So for me, I think at the beginning of this project, I was really just more curious about trying to document this response from a Chinese perspective, just because I think at that time we had no idea that it was going to end up being such a globalized issue. This was kind of like the first step of it. It's just like thinking about people traveling for Chinese New Year. There's a lot of people in China, and I think traveling, especially during Chinese New Year, which in a lot of ways is very similar to, say, Christmas or Thanksgiving in America, or any of the national holidays where you have an extended period of rest, a lot of people are catching up to try to go home and see their loved ones. Now, you factor this in with a new sort of virus, and it can slowly evolve into something that can quickly actually get out of hand. At that time, they had sort of a policy of if you're running a fever of any sort, the main thing is they would put you into quarantine. So that's kind of the root of, I think, this idea that slowly emerged as I was working on this game. It's just this idea of how do you identify and contain people who are potentially sick, right? Because the main thing is if you compare, at that time we didn't really know much about COVID, but if you compare it to, say, I don't know, like the flu, right? So it made sense that it's a virus, and so isolating and quarantining sick individuals would probably be the first step that would help kind of contain something so drastic. Now, the other thing about China is just the population count, right? So that's kind of where this idea came from. Now, as I was working on the game, a few interesting things started happening. One was that it's what I originally intended to just sort of be a perspective from myself living in China and going through this process became a global issue, and I think Italy was the first one that really started to make me feel the anxiety in some ways. And at that time, we had friends that were living in New York, and they were just like, yeah, I don't know, it seems fine, I hope you guys are okay. And I was like, yeah, I think it's gonna be manageable. I think they've done something like this before, so it shouldn't be that bad. But then as it sort of progressed and it became a globalized kind of issue, that's when things really changed for me and, well, I mean, basically for the world. But for this project especially, I think one of the things that was really fascinating was China became sort of like a model for how other countries were thinking about or going to deal with this issue. A lot of the things I saw in Western media at that time was about the concealment of Chinese data. Now, I think the interesting thing about that is these numbers are strange, right? Like the numbers that were being reported were also, I think generally speaking, for people here, we're pretty aware of like the fact that these might not be the real numbers per se, or the truth of it is, in that moment of chaos, I think when it was first sort of breaking out, I think keeping track of the numbers was, it was the least of people's concerns in some ways. And I think the main thing that became more apparent was how are we going to sort of deal with an issue like this as a collective whole, right? So I think one of the things that the China and Korea and Japan, when they were kind of dealing with the problem of COVID in the beginning, was there's a very strong emphasis on like a collectivism, right? So the fact that like the individuals own rights and freedoms actually is not as important as the way that the entire community deals with the issue at times. So I think that was one of the things that was really interesting. And I think by reading Western media, and especially about certain things about how China's not telling the real numbers, et cetera, I think in a lot of ways, I don't even think, even if they were trying to report real numbers, I don't even think that they knew how many people were really infected. They were actually just more concerned about trying to get on top of it before it became something that would infect like a billion people, right? So that was kind of an interesting thing to me to sort of think about and explore. And the other thing is, if we say that, there is a general consensus of like, I don't know where these numbers are coming from. I don't even know if it's real or not. However, I think the main thing is like, are there reasons to sort of, why would people in positions of power underreport cases? Are they, they are also people, right? We do have to consider that. And what are the punishments or backlashes they might face? What would happen to them if they don't do a good job of actually containing the virus? This is the very first prototype. I think it took about like a week or so, but in general, I'll show the video now. You can take a look at it. But in general, I think, I mean, the basic mechanic there is sort of just looking at how you can sort of scan people for temperatures, because of there was this thing of everywhere you went after they sort of went through that process of locking it down, whichever business, whether it be like going to the supermarket, you just have a person with like a little scanner, and they scan you to make sure that you did not run a fever, and then if so, you can go in and do your thing, right? So that was kind of the first part of this game, and then combining it with the idea of traveling was sort of the root of it. So after sort of the initial prototype, I went into basically like an alpha. Basically with the alpha, the main thing was getting the sort of scanning mechanic working, but then sort of doing what I was talking about with looking at how like Western media was sort of portraying the situation in China as it was unfolding. That's where this idea that I had about public panic and stress came out. Stress being the sort of an individualistic look at the person who was in charge of the situation. Public panic being, in essence, like a perspective on collectivism, right? The idea of like, there is an entirely, world that have people who can actually, like be drastically affected by the situation. So I think the reporting and underreporting thing kind of became, I tweaked that a lot, and honestly I think in hindsight I should have spent a little bit more time figuring out the numbers for that, but it just became this thing of, you can either sort of do your job, right, and report the real numbers, but with this sense that you might be causing more and more sort of panic within the general populace. And I think if you think about it in terms of like, living in China where there are so many people, if those numbers explode, right, which it might have, I think you would have seen a lot more, crazy stuff happening. So I think part of it was trying to figure out that, but also on the flip side, there needs to be sort of this internal, pressure of the fact that you're not able to sort of, if you underreport, that's kind of on you, and maybe that's something that you hold true to yourself, that like you're actually not letting on to the public like what the actual truth of the situation is. So that's kind of where that mechanic sort of came in. I'm not sure if it 100% works. I made it when I was quite stressed out myself. So I think that is I hope you can feel that a little bit when you play the game. So from there, we moved on to sort of the release, the version 1, I call it, right? the version one of it, you know, it's basically just a layer of polish on top. The other thing about this project that I really sort of enjoyed was I had never done 3D modeling. I'm also not very good at it, but it was, you know, there's so much time during lockdown that I just kind of went, well, you know, if I'm going to work on this game, I might as well try to learn something new while doing it. So, you know, I picked up Blender, lots of YouTube videos for that, and just gave a shot at trying to make some 3D assets. I think that in hindsight, that kind of explains why it can lag out a lot because apologies for that for the game. But just, you know, it was my first shot at trying to do some 3D related work. That was the first version that went online, 1.0. And from there, you know, this is a very crazy process. I think generally with some of my other projects, my take on game development is sort of it's a playtest centric sort of model. It's a prototype playtest sort of circle where it's prototyping something, playtesting it, and then iterating on the prototype and then going in that loop. But with this project, I mean, the truth of the matter was there was literally no one I could really playtest with. Now, when I conduct playtests, generally speaking, I like to do playtests in person. So you'd have someone play the game and then you'd be next to them and you would observe them. Because playtesting is not just about what they're doing on screen, the actions, but actually what the player's sort of emotional response is to the project, right? So I think that's part of the thing that made this game really hard to do for me is just I couldn't, you know, I playtested with my partner, but that was pretty much just it. Like I found like one friend who was also in Shanghai in sort of lockdown, and she was graciously you know, offered to help do a Zoom call twice for this project. And from there, it was nice because at least I could see what she was doing mechanically, but I couldn't really get a sense of like how she felt about the game other than it's very hard and I feel stressed, which I guess, you know, that's kind of playing a game about COVID during COVID is, well, it's not exactly very fun. Anyways, this project was fast. It was really really fast. Basically, about 4 months from that initial prototype you saw. I think it took about a month or two to get to alpha, and then a couple of months for the 3D. The main thing was learning how to try to use Blender, which I feel like now I know it a lot better, but in that time I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing with Blender. But that's pretty much it. And then the big thing that was really difficult was trying to figure out, it's a simulation game. In some ways, it's a silly simulation game, I'd say, because some of the behaviors I was modeling is not really grounded in reality, but it's an abstraction of a feeling. And I think the main thing I wanted to do was just go at it from sort of more of a personal perspective on the issue. This isn't really what I was doing. It isn't really science, but it is just like ideas behind like if, you know, people are within a certain distance from each other and someone sneezes, then they would get infected, right? So like very simple kind of ideas around that. The biggest thing that took the most time is this whole entire thing about trying to balance out the reporting and underreporting. I knew that was a really interesting thing to do. I think in hindsight, I should have probably spent more time testing that element, but for now, you know, it is what it is, and I think I'm pretty happy with the final product, and I'm in essence kind of done with the game. I don't think I will really ever go back to it because I think for me it was a document of a time and a place that hopefully I don't have to live through. Well, still living through that, but hopefully I don't have to explore the anxieties and stress of, you know, when I was trying to make this as it was happening. So that's just a general kind of overview of the project. Now, there is a few questions that I see that Chris sent over from you all, so I'm going to try my best to answer them. They're all really good questions, but yeah, it's interesting because it's been a while since I've really thought about this game, or even actually today was the first time in like 2 years since, you know, I downloaded it and I was playing it for the first time again and felt A lot of weird emotions coming up about making that project. So the first question is from Hannah. How have your degrees in film, game design, business, and entertainment from NYU and intercultural studies informed the ways you have sought out your creative outlets? Do you think degrees were necessary for film, games, and community building? Good question. I think I've always wanted to make stuff. In high school, basically was making short films with my friends, and we were doing little things like we ran like a little after school film meetup of sorts, where we just like make silly videos. I think it's kind of the opposite in terms of like when I went to school, I wanted to go to sort of like an art school to try to explore some of these things that I had within me that I was interested in doing. And I think there are certain things that definitely really influenced me. Certain classes that really changed the way I kind of thought about the medium itself. And I think especially like for games, I never really thought that games could be a career or just like a path I could take. But after taking a few classes that were more focused on the artistic merit of games, then I started to realize, oh, they actually have a lot of potential to be more than just like commercial entertainment properties. I think the main thing is I didn't try to restrict myself within the study that I went to school for. And I think if I did that, I would probably end up with an entire sort of curriculum based around filmmaking. I probably would never sort of go into games. But I think one of the things that's really nice about this time in college and when you're thinking about taking classes and stuff is sometimes just taking things because you kind of personally have an interest or the title of the course sounds interesting. They can kind of open up your perspective and they can influence the kind of stuff that you actually want to be doing. Like one of my classes that, practically was probably not that good for a career was an experimental filmmaking class. But from a artistic creative perspective, it was amazing. Like it really opened up my eyes to the ideas behind like visual storytelling and how you could kind of do things that are so out of the bounds of normal and they can evoke emotions. So in a lot of ways, I think take classes that you are, you just have like you just are interested in like kind of things that they're talking about, because they can sometimes have really good lasting kind of effects on the things that you want to explore or do in the future. Okay, number 2, how have your experiences, particularly during COVID lockdown, framed the ways you explore different mediums? For example, something like in-person installations weren't possible. Did you seek out something similar or adapt in other ways? So lockdown in China, if you could even call it a lockdown, it was sort of this isolation period for just about 3 months. And after 3 months, it was kind of back to normal. The thing was, I think when we were coming out of lockdown, around the summertime, like that was when the rest of the world was starting to sort of go into a heavier and heavier sort of response to the situation. So the main thing was indirectly, I think COVID really affected my work. I think the main thing that I realized after that was just the importance of community. And that sort of led me to sort of think about how I can sort of form communities around ideas. And that sort of led me ultimately to starting a program where it's just more of a community based around storytelling and games in Shanghai. And that, I think, idea really came out because of the period of isolation where I realized I wasn't really connecting with anyone creatively. Okay, this question is from Annabella. Another question for Mike. Could there be a novel Containment 2? What game mechanics would represent our new anxieties as the pandemic has gone on? I really don't want to make a novel Containment 2. I think I've had enough of COVID. And I don't know if that would be a project I would ever sort of want to continue with. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this game that I would thinking about the whole thing. I think one game mechanic that is really interesting that I would be curious if someone could make a game related to this is actually the idea of contact tracing. So in China, basically, you have like a QR code that tracks exactly where you've been. And that was actually kind of a new development that when I was making the game, I think that system was just kind of being implemented slowly. But nowadays it's quite advanced and complex. I think in essence, if you check into just any location, there's a person that scans your QR code. And then that keeps a track of time, log, the person and where they live and all that information. And so what happens is if one person gets sort of a case, right? A new case emerges. Then they would be able to backtrace all the places that that person went, and through that they would be able to identify everyone that was in that area at that same time, and then they would be able to contact everyone there and ask them to do a COVID test. And I think what's really fascinating about the contact tracing that was happening in Shanghai is that, in essence, you don't have to lock down an entire city. There are isolated cases, and there still is. I think even today there was like an isolated case that happened. Once they identify the person that has COVID, right? So they test positive for COVID. They look at the logs of all the places that that person has been. They contact all of the people, and then all of those people go into a 2-week self quarantine, basically. If cases get really bad, what they'll do is they can start locking down specific districts, right? It goes to something as specific as if there's a case that's discovered in a building, they can just lock down the building. Instead of locking down the entire city and shutting everything down, they try to isolate as much as they can to a very specific kind of place, and then they lock that down. And I think this model works really well because the lockdown makes sense. You basically self-quarantine for 2 weeks. There is food and Wi-Fi and all of that good stuff delivered to you, and then basically you just stay home. And that sort of keeps the city running around you, and you quarantine with everyone who might have been infected through your actions in that kind of method. So I think contact tracing is a really interesting thing that if there was ever an opportunity to make a game about that, I think that's something that I think could be a really interesting idea. The other thing that was I never was able to do, I think, for Novel Containment I was making, it was originally I wanted to finish a chapter in China and sort of the response here, and then do a sort of another level that's set in New York. And sort of explore the New York subway system and the idea of how they were going to manage or control, the flow of people in that place and how it would be sort of the same but different. But I think one of the things is the situation in New York got so out of hand that like I just had no idea what was really going on over there for a while. And I think the other thing was after this project, I was really just like kind of over COVID in a sense. Like I just didn't really feel like continuing down this kind of path. I think a lot of these like kind of projects that are a little bit heavier in this sense, when you're doing it in the moment, all you can really do is explore the problems as they are emerging for you. But it does take time, right, to kind of consider what it means once you have more information about what is actually happening. And I think with this project, a lot of it was really more about capturing the moment, right, versus sort of making an overarching deep dive into this issue at hand, right? It was more documentary in that sense. Okay, so the next question is from Kai. Hello, Mike. I was wondering if your knowledge now of how the COVID-19 pandemic has evolved worldwide since Novel Containment was released could affect your process of creating a game. Would you have made any choices differently in terms of gameplay and or design, looking back on it? So actually, I mean, it's interesting, but yeah, I just played the game again today before this video. I think it was what it was. I mean, I think the one thing that was kind of weird for me replaying it again is the end, right? So the end is basically If you get to 100% containment, it's like the entire problem is solved. That's pretty much it. It was just like, congratulations, you've won, and everything's good. I think in hindsight, it's fascinating because when I was making it, that was the hope, really. It's the fantasy, right? Is that one day this will all end and we can just go back to our lives. But I think what's really fascinating is as this continued, that's not the case. And it actually changes a lot of things in the world. If there was anything I would maybe change is kind of revisit the ending of that project. Just the way that it ends right now is so fantasy-esque because, well, I think the fantasy was an escapism of the reality of it when I was making it. But yeah, that's probably the only thing I would do differently. So this is a question from Huda. Hi, Mike. I'm wondering, since you released novel Containment up until now, have you noticed a difference in reaction to the game based off of people's locations and backgrounds? I'm wondering if there have been varying reactions to the game depending on where people are from, as I think it has a large effect on how people perceive COVID-19. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the game came out. So I was basically talking to one of my friends about sort of doing a game on COVID, and she was quite interested in thinking about like how this could sort of be a project. I think. Uh, I think the main thing is this game is quite niche. I think there's a few things that make it not exactly accessible to a range of people. A lot of the other projects that I try to do are actually a lot more simplified in terms of mechanics. Like, like Hazy Days is one button. Like, that's it. I think Night Flyer, the Bat game, is just two buttons. That's it. And I think with this one, I kind of went a little bit crazy, right? Like, trying to make a game during COVID. And I tried to, do something more in the simulated life game, SLG kind of genre. It was so super challenging for me. I had no idea what I was doing a lot of times with the mechanics. A lot of the reaction stuff I would get is actually, like I was saying earlier, it's more about the way that I conduct playtesting. I like to watch people play my games to understand what they're feeling or coming from, and that also allows me to make better use of the mechanics and make things more accessible to people. But with this game, like, yeah, there was no playtesting. I really kind of, in a lot of ways, this project existed sort of in a vacuum for myself. I think it's been covered in a few different little places, but a lot of times it's more just like, here's a game about COVID. Please don't play it, really, because everyone's going through COVID, so why would you play a game about COVID? So I think it's interesting. I think the main thing about this project that I'm happy to have done is part of the live factor of it. It was just kind of like making it in the moment for me. And I think maybe one day, if once we hopefully return back to a society in which we don't have to worry about COVID, it would be interesting to then kind of think about what this game means. One of my hopes would be like one day maybe there would be some sort of exhibition regarding games that came out during COVID that really tried to explore this issue from different perspectives. And I think that's a situation where I would really like to kind of be a part of, with a game that's this kind of heavy or difficult in some regards to kind of deal with. I think giving it space to breathe is a better call for it. Yeah. So I hope that kind of answers your question. It's a really good question. Okay. The last question is from Indigo. What are the responses to your games? How has your experience been with funding and getting resources to develop games when some of your games view your games as controversial? Well, I think the responses to this game, I think, is I answered a little bit earlier. It's a vacuum. I have no idea. I hope people try it. I hope they kind of interpret it however they like. For me, it was more a project to keep me sane during COVID. Now, the second part I think is kind of interesting. Experience with funding and getting resources to develop games. Every now and then I have an itch to sort of create something that is not restricted by money. Let's put it this way, right? So I think I don't really actively seek funding for my projects, because I believe that money changes the relationship. I think money does the thing where if you seek funding through organizations, um, there is sort of a agenda, right? So there is a sort of a purpose that these institutions are going to fund your project, and I think the thing about that is that it can start as a creator, as someone who's making projects, it can start to change or subtly shift your intention for the work. Um, and I think that's something that I try to stay away from because I think I personally like to just make things because I think they're just interesting and why not? Really, a lot of it's just why not. But I think when money becomes part of the equation, it does become more like you have considerations. There are some things that you just can't do. I mean, I think it makes sense. You have to fit into um, the the logistics and the goals of whoever is going to give you the support, right? And so in a lot of ways, I don't think this game kind of these games that I make is necessarily a like a career job for me. I have my job. I do my other projects for money. Like the relationship is very clear there. But with these game projects, it's closer to in some ways you can say it's more of a hobby. But in other ways, I think it's more of just I have it for myself. It's a creative outlet. That ultimately is what it is. And through treating it as just something I can do and it's enjoyable and it's fun just for me, then I retain the ability to make the things that maybe can be seen as controversial because ultimately there's no risk of the project fails commercially. So I think that's kind of my take on it. Now, that's not to recommend you don't go through funding for your own personal projects. I think with funding you can get a lot more done. As you can see, these projects that I make are incredibly small. Like, they're just short, less than 10-15 minute experiences, right? So as an individual creator, you can go very fast. You can prototype and iterate and design ideas really quickly, but it's very hard to go far. So if I were to say expand this idea into a bigger project, I mean, you personally will just get burned out because it's just you by yourself in front of a computer. And so I think in that regard, funding comes into use when it's like there's a bigger idea and there's a bigger purpose. And if the place that's funding you and the project that you're doing have very similar goals and can be mutually beneficial, then that's a really great relationship. And so that is something that I would definitely I would look into if you have projects that literally organizations are looking for things like this to help. I hope that's informative or it was kind of helpful. Thanks so much for playing Novel Containment and sort of discussing it in your class. Thanks again, Chris, for inviting me to talk to your students. If you're interested in sort of my work, I'll throw up my website. It's just mikeyren.com. My itch.io page has a lot of the sort of independent indie hobby games that I make. Other than that, I won't take up any more of your time. Have a really great day, and I hope in the future we'll be able to meet in person. But until then, thanks so much, and goodbye.